Hey guys, it's Sunshine and welcome to my studio. Today we're doing 8 super simple, super easy and super quick tips before you actually start watercolor painting. Right, jumping straight in. Tip number 1, use watercolor paper. This is the first one and I feel like I've said it a million times before, but it's one of the most important. Watercolor paper is not normal paper. That's because it's more fibrous and more absorbent than regular paper, like say printer paper. Watercolor painting uses a lot of water, which the name suggests, with watercolor pigment suspended in that water. Without watercolor paper, the paint doesn't absorb as well as it needs to, and your water paint mix, which is called a wash, by the way, just rolls around all over the top of the paper. Plus, the more water you add, the floppier the paper gets, and the more your brush will wear, pill, and eventually tear the paper. So to round it up, it doesn't matter the GSM, although thick is easier, whether it's cold pressed or hot pressed paper, but it does need to be specifically watercolor paper. Remember that and your life will be so much easier. Tip 2, masking tape. Masking tape is your friend. It has so many wonderful uses in watercolor that you will want a few spare rolls hanging around in your studio. Okay, so the 2 major uses. Firstly, once you tape your paper down to a flat surface, you add water to your paper. If it's taped down, no matter how the water bends and distorts your work, as soon as it dries again, it'll stretch right back into the shape which it started with. If we don't use masking tape and just let it dry, well then it ends up with wrinkles and bends in the paper and no one wants that. Secondly, it's a great option to give ourselves a nice clean border. This one isn't essential, but I prefer the look. It cleans up any overpainting you might have done and you have that lovely bonus when you get that wonderful peeling satisfaction once you finish a project. Number 3, have a hairdryer. Now this one is not completely 100% a requirement of painting with watercolor, but if you want to sit down and paint and not have to wait on paint drying, this is an awesome time saver. Because we're working with water here, when we paint 2 colors side by side, we have to be careful that they don't unintentionally bleed into each other. What we tend to do to stop this is paint a section and then move far enough away to paint something else so the unintentional bleeding doesn't occur. Anyway, this is where the hairdryer comes in. With it, we can quickly and simply dry any sections we want, then paint over it or paint next to it without worrying. This is a huge time saver and can help avoid any unintentional mistakes. You notice that I'm saying unintentional here because sometimes the bleeding and blending is just what you want, and even the act of drying naturally can give you a more organic and washy feel. Experiment with it and without the hairdryer and see what you like and what you don't. Another hairdry tip is that if you, like me, use cheap masking tape, it can sometimes tear your paper up when you're pulling it off, which is really annoying and looks terrible. If you simply heat the tape up as you pull the masking tape, it will melt the glue and give you a stress-free tape pull. Voila, no tearing of the paper. Tip 4, watercolor brushes, use them. I swear not all of these tips are so blatantly obvious, I promise. I've had a couple of people message me and tell me that they've had issues with paper wearing and pilling as they paint. There can be several reasons for this, but one of the main issues they've had is that they're not using watercolor brushes. Like watercolor paper, watercolor brushes are different from acrylic and oil. Not only are watercolor brushes shorter, but they are much softer. With acrylic and oil painting, the paint is much denser, so the brushes are stiff and slightly coarse, but with the watercolor, it's a blend of pigment and water-based ingredients that are much thinner and lighter, so we want a brush that's gentle and super duper soft. What won't tear your paper up? Watercolor brushes won't. Tip 5, plan to paint backwards. Not literally, that would be strange and frankly really hard. Okay, so let me explain. In most forms of painting, the artist paints with their darks first and then works lighter. But with watercolor, it's the complete opposite. With watercolor paints, you want to begin with the lighter colors and then work backwards towards the darker ones. We do this because in watercolors, most of the white comes from the paper, not from the paints. So what you want to do is just take a moment to plan how you're going to paint your piece. Start with the light colors and then layer the darker. Tip 6, keep it light. Well, your lines, anyway. Okay, keeping tip 5 in mind, most people sketch out their piece on watercolor paper before they start painting. But as we've just learned from tip 5, with watercolor we try and use the whites from the paper as whites or light areas in our piece. This means that often there's a very thin layer of pigment over your pale colors. If we draw our sketch too dark or too heavy on the pencil, it'll come through as visible behind your painting and make everything look a bit yuck. If you want to, you can even go so far as to erase your lines as you go. Personally, I usually don't, but I draw everything so light to be almost invisible, unless it's on the camera, otherwise you can't see what I'm doing. Tip 7, mix more paint than you think you'll need. Okay, so we're nearly ready to paint, but remember, watercolor painting is in part a lot of planning and preparing. One of the simple things I try to do is mix more of a color than I think I'm going to need. There is nothing worse than getting halfway through a piece with one color and then having it run out, so you have to remix it and try and match the original color. It's just a super simple idea that will help you as you go along. Mix more so you've always got more to finish your painting. Tip 8. Take plenty of breaks. One of the hardest things I've had to learn is to just step away occasionally and come back to a piece with fresh eyes. Particularly if you're having issues with your work and you're not 100% happy with it, a break refreshes, revitalizes and reinvigorates everything. And it does give you a moment just to clear your mind and come back with fresh ideas and perspective. You know what's the best thing for breaks? Why, tea, of course. So that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed my 8 super simple tips for watercolor. If you guys have any really simple tips for watercolor painting, leave them in the comments below. I would love to read them. As always, make sure you're following me on Instagram and Facebook. Like and subscribe here on YouTube and tick the little bell for notifications. I hope you all have a wonderful week. Keep on painting and I will chat to you all very soon.